Mrs. Whitmore, I just need to confirm one thing, the young woman at the bank said with a polite smile. How have you been managing your inheritance over the past 3 years? I stared at her, convinced I had misunderstood. My what? The smile slowly faded from her face. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Around us, people continued walking through the marble lobby, chatting quietly as if nothing unusual had happened. But for me, the world seemed to stand completely still. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 71 years old, and until that morning, I believed I knew every important detail my late husband had left behind. Thomas and I had been married for 44 years. We built a comfortable life together in a quiet Ohio town, raised one son, celebrated anniversaries on the same front porch, and promised each other that whoever remained would never have to worry about the future. When Thomas passed away after a brief illness 3 years earlier, I thought the hardest part would be learning how to live without hearing his footsteps in the hallway every evening. I never imagined the real heartbreak would begin long after the funeral flowers had faded. The bank employee glanced at her computer again, then looked back at me with growing uncertainty. Mrs. Whitmore, according to our records, the estate account was fully transferred years ago. I felt my fingers tighten around my purse. There must be some mistake, I answered quietly. I never received any inheritance. She hesitated before lowering her voice. Would you mind waiting just a few minutes? I'd like my branch manager to review the file. I nodded because I could not trust myself to say another word. I sat near the tall windows overlooking the parking lot, watching families come and go beneath a bright spring sky. Everything outside looked perfectly ordinary, yet inside my chest, questions were beginning to pile up faster than I could answer them. If Thomas had truly left something for me, where had it gone? Why had no one ever mentioned it? And why did a strange feeling tell me that someone in my own family already knew the answer? A few minutes later, I noticed my son Daniel walking through the front entrance with his wife, Emily. They had no idea I was already there. Emily laughed softly as she adjusted her designer handbag, completely relaxed, until her eyes met mine across the lobby. In that single instant, her smile disappeared, and I knew this was no misunderstanding. Someone had taken something that belonged to me, and before the day was over, I was determined to discover exactly who had been living on a future my husband had intended for me. The branch manager invited me into a quiet office and gently closed the door behind us. He introduced himself as Michael Turner, then placed a thick folder on the desk with careful hands. He did not look like a man preparing to deliver good news. Instead, he wore the expression of someone trying to understand a puzzle that should never have existed. He opened the file and slowly turned several pages toward me. Every document carried my name. Every statement listed an estate account that had once belonged to Thomas. Every monthly report showed transfers that I had never seen before. I studied the pages until the words became a blur. I recognized my address, my birthday, and even my signature on one authorization form. But I knew with complete certainty that I had never signed it. My handwriting had always been neat and deliberate. This signature looked like someone had copied it after only a quick glance. Mr. Turner apologized and explained that he could not discuss every detail until the legal department reviewed the records, but he quietly admitted that several transactions already appeared unusual. He asked whether I had ever authorized another person to manage my financial affairs. I answered without hesitation. Never. Thomas always believed I should understand every dollar we owned. He spent years teaching me how to balance accounts, pay taxes, and read investment statements because he used to smile and say, "If anything ever happens to me, I want you to stand on your own feet." Those words echoed in my mind as I stared at the papers. I had trusted that promise because I had trusted my family. Leaving the office, I remembered moments that had once seemed ordinary. Daniel insisting on collecting my mail because he said he passed my neighborhood every morning. Emily offering to help organize my paperwork after the funeral because she claimed I needed time to grieve. She even encouraged me to throw away old envelopes and folders, saying they were only painful reminders. At the time, I believed she was being thoughtful. Now every memory carried a different weight. I reached my car but did not start the engine. Instead, I sat behind the steering wheel watching people load groceries into their trunks across the parking lot. They laughed with their children, waved to neighbors, and continued with ordinary lives. Mine no longer felt ordinary. Somewhere between my husband's funeral and that quiet afternoon at the bank, pieces of my future had quietly disappeared. The most painful realization was not that money might have been taken. It was that someone I loved had needed me to remain completely unaware. The following morning, I walked into my home with different eyes. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt unfamiliar. The framed photographs on the fireplace still showed smiling birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, and summer afternoons at the lake. Daniel stood beside me in so many of them, always with one arm around Emily, both of them looking like the kind of family every mother hopes to have. I made a pot of coffee but barely touched it. Instead, I opened the small filing cabinet Thomas had bought for me years ago. Every folder was arranged exactly the way he liked, each document labeled in neat handwriting. Tax returns were there. Property records were there. Insurance papers were there. But every folder related to the estate was strangely thin. Important letters were missing. Statements that should have arrived every quarter simply did not exist. I remembered Emily offering to organize everything a few weeks after the funeral. She had insisted that I needed rest, not paperwork. She spent an entire Saturday sorting files while Daniel repaired a loose railing on my porch. Before leaving, she carried 2 large boxes to her sport utility vehicle and smiled. She told me they were filled with old magazines, duplicate receipts, and unnecessary clutter. I thanked her for helping. Now I could not remember ever looking inside those boxes. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of my mailbox closing. Outside, I found only advertisements and a grocery flyer. It reminded me that for nearly 3 years Daniel had often stopped by before I returned from my morning walks. He always joked that he was saving me the trip to the mailbox because he drove past my street on the way to work. At the time I thought it was a thoughtful habit. Now I wondered how many envelopes had disappeared before I ever knew they existed. That afternoon I searched through an old desk drawer and found a small notebook where Thomas had written passwords, account numbers, and reminders shortly before his health declined. On the last page, he had left one sentence in blue ink. "If anything ever feels wrong, trust the records, not appearances." I read those words again and again until tears filled my eyes. Thomas had never been suspicious of people, but he believed facts always outlived excuses. For the first time since leaving the bank, I stopped asking whether something had happened by accident. Too many missing papers, too many convenient favors, and too many perfect explanations had quietly formed a pattern. Someone had carefully removed every path that could have led me to the truth. I closed the notebook, placed it gently into my purse, and realized my next conversation would not begin with accusations. It would begin with questions that only one person in my family could answer honestly, whether they wanted to or not. The next afternoon, I called Daniel and invited him to lunch at the little family diner where Thomas and I had celebrated countless anniversaries over the years. He sounded surprised, but agreed without hesitation. Emily said she already had plans with friends, so Daniel arrived alone, smiling warmly as if nothing in our lives had changed. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. The weather had finally turned warm. His company was hiring new employees. My flower beds were beginning to bloom again. I watched him carefully while he spoke. He looked relaxed, completely comfortable, and for a brief moment, I questioned my own suspicions. Then I remembered the missing documents, the unfamiliar signatures, and Thomas's handwritten reminder. I gently asked, "Daniel, do you remember helping me with my mail after your father passed away?" He smiled and nodded. "Of course, Mom. I just wanted to make things easier for you." I thanked him before asking another question. "Did you ever notice letters from the bank or from your father's attorney?" His smile faded only slightly. "I do not really remember. There were so many envelopes back then." His answer sounded reasonable, but he looked away before finishing the sentence. Daniel had always looked directly into my eyes whenever he spoke. That tiny change did not prove anything, but it settled quietly in my mind beside every other unanswered question. I decided not to press him further. Instead, I asked whether Emily had ever helped with my financial paperwork. He laughed softly. Emily loves organizing documents. You know how she is. She probably saved you weeks of work. I forced a small smile, although something inside me tightened. Before we left, Daniel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Dad would be happy to see us looking after each other. Those words should have brought comfort. Instead, they reminded me of another afternoon years earlier when Thomas had sat at this very diner. He looked at Daniel with pride and said, "Character is the only inheritance that cannot be spent." At the time we all smiled because it sounded like one of his thoughtful sayings. Now it felt like a warning that had taken years to understand. After lunch, I drove directly to the office of Harold Benson, the attorney who had handled Thomas's estate. His receptionist recognized my name immediately and quietly told me that Mr. Benson had been hoping I would eventually call. Those words sent a chill through me. If he had been waiting for me, then perhaps someone else had been working just as hard to make sure I never walked through that office door until it was almost too late. Harold Benson welcomed me into his office with a look that carried both surprise and concern. He had aged since Thomas's memorial service, his hair now almost completely silver, but his handshake remained steady. He invited me to sit before opening a thick estate file that had my husband's name embossed across the front. For several quiet moments, he simply turned pages, comparing notes that only he seemed to understand. Finally, he looked at me and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Margaret, did you ever attend the final estate review meeting that we scheduled 6 weeks after Thomas passed away?" I shook my head. I told him no one had mentioned such a meeting to me. According to my calendar from that year, I had spent that afternoon at home planting roses in the backyard because I believed every legal matter had already been completed. Mr. Benson frowned and reached for another folder. Inside was a copy of a notification letter addressed to my home. It had been mailed by certified delivery, yet I had never seen it. He quietly explained that after receiving no response, his office had later been contacted by someone claiming to be helping me organize my affairs while I recovered from my loss. That person requested that future correspondence be sent electronically until I felt ready to handle paperwork again. I felt my heart sink. I had never made such a request. I rarely used email except to exchange family photographs with Daniel. Mr. Benson slid another document across the desk. It listed an email address that differed from mine by only a single letter. At first glance, it looked identical, but one small change would have sent every message somewhere else. I stared at it in disbelief. It was such a simple alteration that I could easily have overlooked it forever. Benson did not accuse anyone. He simply said the record suggested that someone had redirected important communications during the months immediately following Thomas's passing. He also explained that the estate had included safeguards designed to protect me, and those safeguards depended on honest communication between his office and the rightful beneficiary. As I left his office carrying copies of the documents, I understood that the truth would not reveal itself through anger or assumptions. It would come from patient attention to facts, one record at a time. Whoever had arranged those changes had expected me to stop asking questions. Instead, every answer I uncovered gave me another reason to keep searching. Several days passed before I made another move. I did not call Daniel. I did not mention the missing records to Emily. Instead, I carefully gathered every document Mr. Benson had copied for me and placed them into a new folder that never left my side. Each evening I sat at my dining room table where Thomas and I had shared thousands of meals, comparing dates, signatures, mailing records, and account statements. The more I read, the clearer one fact became. Whoever redirected those communications had relied on silence more than deception. If I had asked one question sooner, the entire chain of events might have unraveled years earlier. That realization was painful, but it was also freeing. I could not change the past, yet I still had control over what happened next. Early the following week, Mr. Benson called with an update. His office had located archived correspondence showing exactly when the alternate email address first appeared in the estate file. It had been added only days after Thomas's memorial service, during a period when I was still struggling to adjust to life alone. Benson explained that the records themselves did not prove who had made the request, but they established a clear timeline that would allow the financial institutions to conduct a formal review. He advised me to remain patient and avoid confronting anyone until the documentation had been fully examined. I agreed without hesitation. For the first time in months, I felt no urgency to argue or defend myself. Facts would speak far more clearly than emotions ever could. That evening, Daniel called to ask whether I wanted to join him and Emily for dinner the coming weekend. His voice sounded warm and familiar, just as it always had. I accepted the invitation, knowing that I needed to observe rather than accuse. If there were innocent explanations, they deserved to be heard. If there were not, the truth would reveal itself soon enough. After hanging up, I walked into the backyard where Thomas had planted 2 maple trees shortly after we moved into our home. Their branches had grown tall over the decades, surviving storms, harsh winters, and long summers without losing their roots. Standing beneath them, I finally understood something my husband had tried to teach me throughout our marriage. Trust is precious because it grows slowly, but once it is shaken, only honesty can restore it. Whatever waited ahead for my family, I knew I would face it calmly, one documented fact at a time, because the future Thomas wanted for me deserved nothing less.